First of all, I'd like to greet everyone a Happy New Year. And as we have already bid farewell to 2017, we first of all need to be thankful because of all the blessings that the Lord has showered on us, as well as the trials, the testings that He allows our way. At the same time, we leave behind the sins and the failures of the past year, as we have been given a clean slate to work with. Now, as we face 2018, let's remember that God is also giving us new opportunities, new challenges. He's also inviting us that this year, let us grow even more closer to Him. And so may we all embrace what God has in store for us this year, even in the years to come. Now, each new year, we aim for improvement in every facet of our life. And this desire may not necessarily be called a New Year's resolution. We sometimes call them New Year's resolution. Sometimes we just say, we want to improve, we want to be better. Now, why do I not say that we do New Year's resolutions? Because New Year's resolutions sometimes have this tendency to rely on human effort. That we need to exert so much effort in order to accomplish our goals. But when we fail, then we blame ourselves and we quit altogether. That's the problem. Let me relate to you something that I read on January 1 in my devotion. Nicky Gumbel, the founder of the Alpha Course, he related that there was this one time that he went to the gym on January 1. And he saw that on January 1, all the gym personnel were dragging out all these gym equipments to the floor. Extra gym equipments. What was the reason? The reason was because on January 1, the gym would be packed, would be fully packed with people. Why? Because everyone had this New Year's resolution, I want to be fit. And so on January 1, everyone is in the gym. But by around January 7, all the extra equipment will have been stored again. Okay. Why? Because everyone, or almost everyone, had given up on their New Year's resolution. And the number of people that are going to the gym had dropped back to the normal level. And so instead of a New Year's resolution, I'd like to propose that we make something else. I'd like to coin it as grace resolutions. We make plans to change certain facets of our lives or to attain certain goals, but we do them not out of our own power, not out of our own skill, but instead we rely on the grace of God. We rely on the power of God. We rely on His timing, His wisdom, and His empowerment to complete what He wants us to do. Now, personally, for 2018, there are some grace resolutions that I have. The first one has to do with health. My last medical checkup yielded some not so good results. And I've committed that, okay, I will modify a couple of things. One is my diet. I have to modify my diet. Okay, so even before the year started, I've already began cutting down on my carbs and sugars. And then I'm also telling myself I have to start using that exercise machine that has been gathering dust in my house for more than a year. And also to, again, ride the bicycle. That's also gathering dust, except that I wipe it every now and then, so it looks clean. The second resolution has to do with the intellect. I committed that for this year, I want to read at least a book a month so that I can grow in knowledge, as well as to redevelop again the discipline of reading regularly. And then my third resolution has to do with prayer, as I would like to spend more quality time in prayer than before. Now, for me to be able to keep these resolutions, is not so much about relying on my own power or my own strength or on my skills. But rather, it's all about a complete reliance on God to help me. That's why I said these are grace resolutions. It's not about me. You see, if I trust in my own abilities, what's going to happen is that there will come a stage when you will tire and you will give up early. And you probably would say to yourself, why bother? Just as we've all done with our plans in the past, we made plans, things didn't go well, and we say, why bother? We quit. So instead, when we have what are known as grace resolutions, what happens is, when there are stumbling blocks, when there are failures along the way, we recognize that, okay, they happen, but by the grace of God, I can stand up again and continue. And so that's why I want to propose that we make what are known as grace resolutions, rather than just simply New Year's resolutions. But then, this is a perennial problem we surely have. The failure to trust God in all matters. That's why we rely on ourselves, we rely on our strength. And so, this is manifested even in how we keep our resolutions or our promises to change. It's all dependent on ourselves. It's not dependent on God. It's because we fail to trust God. You see, our default mode is to trust in ourselves, to trust in other people, to trust in human institutions, like the government, the schools, or even the church. The question is, why don't we trust God in everything? In my opinion, there are three major obstacles why we don't trust God. First, it's because we trust the visible over the invisible. For us, to see is to believe is better than to believe is to see. Do you see the difference? Okay. The person who trusts the visible will say, to see is to believe. Unless I see something, I'm not going to believe. But faith requires that we first of all believe, then we will see. And so it's sometimes difficult for us to trust God because we have this perspective. Second, the issue of timing. We don't understand God's timing. And so because we can't understand the timing of God, why God sometimes seems to delay, what happens is we outright reject trusting God. And we begin to lean on our own understanding, we begin to lean on our own efforts. It's because we don't want to wait for God, or we can't wait for God. There are many good examples of this in the Bible. Like Abraham. God promised Abraham, okay, I'm going to give you a son. But Abraham couldn't wait. And what did he do? He decides to do things his way, or his wife helps him. They did things their way, and they ended up with Ishmael, right? And Ishmael would later on become the headache of Israel. So, you see, sometimes that's what we do. We can't wait on God. We're not sure about His timing. And because of that, we reject God. We reject trusting Him. The third issue, or the third problem, is relevance. Relevance. We think to ourselves, is God still relevant in the light of scientific breakthroughs? Does God still matter in a world where people value experience more than objective truth? That what I feel is more important than what is true? And so, these are the objections that people have against trusting God. They don't trust God because they can't see the invisible, or they cannot trust in the invisible. Second, they don't trust in the timing of God. And thirdly, they're saying, is God still relevant? But in the midst of all these objections about trusting God, what God is telling us is we need to learn to trust Him. And Psalm 146 is a psalm that calls us to trust God and not in human beings. And this call is based on at least three attributes of God that are mentioned in the passage. And these stand in contrast to trusting men. Men have capabilities, men have capacities, yes, but all of these fall short of those of God. And so this psalm will remind us that we should not trust in human beings, in human powers, but we must trust in the Almighty. And this psalm begins with a call to praise the Lord. If you look at the passage, it begins with praise the Lord. And this is characteristic of Psalm 146 all the way to Psalm 150. All these 5 psalms begins with the word praise the Lord, or the Hebrew word hallelujah. And this is a verb in the command form. In other words, the psalmist is telling his readers, you praise the Lord. And here, Psalm 146 is specifically about praising God as being the God not only of the future, but the God of the here and now. God is not someone who is far away in heaven, who crosses his hands and sort of doesn't care. He's not that kind of a God, but instead he's a God who is present, who is relevant, and who is interested in your life. That is what Psalm 146 is all about. And so here we're going to look at 3 attributes of God mentioned in this psalm. And we will contrast God against men. And we will point out how futile, how pointless it is to trust men. And how wise it is to trust God in the here and now. Now the first thing that we learn is that we can trust God because God created and sustains everything. Because God created and sustains everything. If you read verse 6, you will see that it says that God is the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and He's the one who keeps faith forever, or who is faithful forever. And so here in verse 6, the emphasis is the power of God. Or we could say the infinite power of God. If you read the Bible, it's very clear that God created the world and everything in it. In Latin, there's a term that God created the world ex nihilo. What is ex nihilo? It means God created the world from nothing. He simply spoke a word and something came to be. In Genesis 1, we read, God simply said, let there be light. And there was light. And when He said, okay, let there be the creatures of the sea or the creatures of the air, they came to be. And we know from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 that this world came into existence by God's doing. It did not come into existence by accident. That there was some random explosion that happened out there. That's called the Big Bang. And also in God's creation of man, you'll notice that man is described as being fearfully and wonderfully made. We have been made to bear His image. So again, we are not products of accident. We are not the product of some scientific process called evolution. But instead, we have been created. But not only have we been created, God also sustains His creation. That's why we have the phrase in verse 6, who remains faithful forever. He provides for the need of this world. He provides the need of every creature. He provides for our every need, whether directly or through other avenues of grace. Let me give an example of what we mean when we say other avenues of grace. Many people think that it is their ability that have made them wealthy, right? They take, like in Deuteronomy 8, verse 17, they say, "My power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me." That's what they would say. But then God reminded the Israelites in the succeeding verse, in Deuteronomy 8:18, says, "It is He who gives you the ability to produce wealth." So God, here, we find that He gives us not only directly our needs, but He also through other venues or avenues of grace, He provides for us. And so, God here doesn't abandon the world to run on its own. He created the world, and now He continues to sustain this world. Now, God's creative and sustaining power can also be seen in the life of a Christian, in your life, in my life. Why? Because first of all, it is He who has made us new creations in Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:17, right? Reminds us, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. But then, it doesn't end there. Okay? We're not just new creations and then we're left to go on our own. But instead, if you read through the scriptures, you'll find that God continues to sustain us in our daily walk with Christ. He enables us to faithfully follow Him. So you find that even in our own lives, God has done His wonder of recreating us into new creatures, and at the same time, He sustains us. Now, men, on the other hand, are powerless compared to God. Men do not have the ability to save others when called upon. And whatever power that they supposedly possessed in the first place, that all came from God alone. It didn't come from themselves. They are not able to generate that power. Also, their so-called power cannot be sustained. Why? Because men are described as being mortals. In contrast to God, God lives forever. And so, even if man had power, that power is temporary. It is limited by man's mortality. Whereas the power of God is sustained forever. Also, man's so-called power doesn't have the magnitude of God's power. Very often we think that politicians, businessmen, they are powerful. But if you were to compare their power to the power of God, it pales in comparison. For example, think about modern scientists and doctors. Nowadays, some of them think that they're like gods. Why? Because they're now able to do things like clone, right? You take a cell from a creature, and then they're able to spawn a creature back to life. Like, for example, they're now trying to revive extinct animals. Okay? So they're able to find the DNA, the cells of certain extinct animals, let's say the mammoth, okay, the relative to the elephant. Okay, so they're now thinking, okay, we're going to try to clone one. Okay. Now, we know that human cloning is now possible, yes. But can this compare to God? Because God, when He created man, He did it with nothing but dust, right? He simply took dust and He created man. We, on the other hand, we need all these scientific machines. We need to get DNA, we need to get a cell in order to create. And so the implication is that God is all-powerful. And because He is all-powerful and He created this world and He sustains this world, what we need to do is we need to continually trust Him. We have to completely trust Him that He will provide for our needs. Whatever the situation may be in your life. Whatever the problems you may be going through. Why? Because with God, nothing is impossible. It's not to say that we totally distrust men. Rather, we should never think that men have all the answers. Let us never think that men can solve all the problems of a country or of a world. And let us be weary when people promise a lot. Why? Because most likely they will be unable to keep their promises. Now, how can we trust God? Trusting God is evident in a couple of ways. First of all, if you have a need, if you have a situation that you're facing, we need to ask ourselves, do we bring these issues to God in prayer? Or are we beginning to formulate our own plans on how to solve the problem? So ask yourself, when you have a need, how do you show that you trust God? Do you pray? Do you turn to God in prayer? Second, if you say that you trust God, have you stopped worrying? Have you stopped worrying? You see, the psalmist has already declared, God is worth trusting because He is all-powerful. So how can we show that we trust Him? We show that we trust Him by learning to say, okay, Lord, I will stop worrying. I will stop fretting about the future, about this particular situation, because I'm going to trust that He will help me out. A good way to remember these two things is just remember the children's song, Why Worry When You Can Pray? So remember that. Why worry when you can pray? Second, we can trust God because God is our helper in our time of need. You see, God is not just powerful. God is also willing to help. You see, there's a difference, okay? We can say that someone is powerful, but very often there are people who are powerful but who refuses to help. On the other hand, God is not just all-powerful, but He's also willing to help. And He will use His power in the right way. Now, if you look at verses 7 to 9, you will find the following. Here, God is described as executing justice for the oppressed, setting the prisoners free, giving food to the hungry, opening the eyes of the blind. Those who are bowed down, He lifts up. The aliens and the foreigners, they are watched over by God. The widows and the orphans are sustained. All of these people, if you look at them, they have great needs. And what we see is that the Lord comes by their side and helps them. Now, the Bible is filled with numerous references of God helping and God wanting to help. Now, many think that God's deliverance is only for the future or for the afterlife. But when you read Psalm 146, you'll see that here, the psalmist is not just describing something in the future. He's talking about the now. What's happening right now for the people of God. And so what we can say is, His work of deliverance, His work of helping us, does occur here on earth. But it is a foretaste of His greater plan of future redemption, of future salvation. It is a reminder of His greater plan, that He's going to deliver us in the fullest sense. Right now, His deliverance is partial. Because at present, not all of us, when we get sick with, let's say, a deadly disease, not all of us are promised that we will get healed. Some of us will die probably because of cancer, because of a stroke, because of a kidney failure. It's the reality of life. But for some people, they do receive physical relief, they do receive healing. But we have a promise. And the promise is that in the future, we will receive our immortal bodies when Christ returns. And so you see, there's a present reality that occasionally God does heal us, God does restore our bodies, but not always. But there is a future promise of something better. Justice. Not everyone experiences justice in their lifetime. Maybe for some of us, yes, we've experienced justice. But then God promised He will bring His lasting justice very soon. Right now, not all people who sit in prison will be physically set free. Some will be, yes. But others, no. However, because they've come to know Christ, what they've experienced is even better. Freedom from sin, forgiveness in the present, release from the bondage that is much worse than physical prison. And of course, there's the promise in the future that we will forever be set free from the grasp of sin and ultimately delivered from sin and its consequence. So you see, what we see right now is there's the there, here, okay, and the not yet, or the now and the not yet. There are certain things that happens in our life that where God fulfills His promise to help us. But then there's also the ultimate, okay, where God gives us full deliverance. But then contrast this with men. When we talk about men, especially men who are supposedly powerful, many of them are not willing to help, even if they have been given by God the means to help others. And the reason is because very often we act out of selfishness. We think only of our self-preservation, our self-enhancement. That's why sometimes we refuse to help others, even though we have the capability or the capacity to. Others, they help, but they probably expect something in return. I help you, you have to help me. Or in Tagalog, we would say, you have an utang na loob sa akin. I help you now, you owe me a favor soon. Try visiting a government office. And you'll find that there's this one or two employee who will be helpful, who will process your application or your paperwork, provided you give them a bribe. Also, when you think about man's help is inadequate. Because if you read verse 3, the psalmist tells us, do not put your trust in mortal men. Why? Because they cannot save. Even if they are political or military leaders of mighty nations, they cannot truly save us from an enemy. I'm sure that no one here would want to entrust your life to Donald Trump, okay, or to Xi Jinping, or to whatever political ruler we have, or even to Duterte. I'm sure that none of us would ever be crazy enough to say, I will trust him completely with my life. Of course not. Why? Because they are mere mortals. What they have, yes, they may have military power, they may have political power, but it cannot save us. It cannot help us. Even if they had good intentions, they cannot change circumstances. But God can. God can deliver us, whether it's a physical foe or it is the enemy of our soul. God can, and He is willing to help us. And so what's the implication of God being our helper in time of need? Simply this, it is an invitation for us to come freely and boldly before His throne in our time of need and to ask Him for help, to ask Him for deliverance. We find that in Hebrews chapter 4, right? The invitation. And by the way, this is not to discount the help of men who are willing to aid us. But it's simply to point out to us ultimately that God is the one who can come to our aid. Be it through divine intervention or through the help of people. We must also trust God's timing as to when His help will arrive, because it will surely come at the right time. It will never be too early, it will never be too late. God's timing will always be perfect. And finally, We can trust God because God is the righteous one. He is the righteous one. Look at the second half of verse 9. He says here, but the way of the wicked he brings to ruin. Then if you look at verse 8, the second half, it says, the Lord loves the righteous. Then in the first part of verse 7, it says, he executes justice for the oppressed, or he upholds the cause of the oppressed. You know, the Bible is filled with references to the righteousness of God. In fact, it is a very key attribute or character of His. And according to a commentator, God's righteousness is virtually synonymous or equal with His justice. And so an easier way to understand God's righteousness is this. God will always do the right thing consistently, and He will do it without partiality and without prejudice. Without partiality or prejudice. In other words, He will be consistent in executing righteousness. He will always do the right thing. And when He does the right thing, it means He opposes all kinds of sin. He is against sin. That's why God's righteousness, according to the Bible, is ultimately seen in the cross. Jesus took upon Himself the punishment that was rightly due to each one of us. You know, God could have given us salvation without any cost. But then if He did that, He would be unjust. He would not be a righteous God. Why? Because His righteousness demands that for sin, there has to be punishment. And so, how did He address that issue? He addressed it by having His Son go to the cross on our behalf. That's why for us, salvation is free. But it comes at a costly price because someone else paid for it. The cost was the life of His Son, Jesus. You see, the problem of sin had to be dealt with. And if God wants to be true to His attribute of being righteous, then He had to do something so that we could be forgiven, so that we could have salvation. And that's why Jesus had to take our place. Now, contrast the righteousness of God with that of men. In all honesty, not all men act righteously. In fact, many act in contradiction to what the Bible defines as righteousness. For example, why is there oppression? It is because there are people who act out of selfishness, who show favoritism, who show bias towards some, and then who are harsh towards others. Look at the government. Why are there what we call as Kamag-anak Incorporated? Or in English, family incorporated? It means that the father is the president, the daughter is the mayor, the son is the vice mayor. You know what I'm talking about. That's Kamag-anak Incorporated. That's nepotism. That means you appoint a family member, a close friend, a relative to become someone in government. Why? So that you can enrich yourself while you leave others in misery. Also, in the Philippines, we are no strangers to injustice. We hear of people who are deprived of justice and killed on the spot by no less than police officers. Those who were supposed to uphold the law. I think this was especially true last week or 2 weeks ago when a car, a white AUV was shot at by the police. And what they realized was that on board was a woman who was supposed to be brought to the hospital, who was earlier already a victim of a shootout, was supposed to be brought to the hospital, and then the policemen shot at this car. And now the police are trying to whitewash the entire incident. they're saying that the woman has traces of paraffin, saying that she fired a gun. How could she fire a gun if she's already wounded? So you see, the police, the people who are supposed to uphold the law, are not upholding the law, but they are exercising injustice. Now, I'm not saying all police officers are evil and corrupt. I'm not saying that. But there are a couple of them who abuse their authority. And in so doing, they demonstrate not justice, not righteousness, but they demonstrate wickedness. But because God is a righteous God, He's not going to allow injustice or wickedness to prevail. It's evident from the passage that even now, even at this moment, God is already exercising justice in this world. Everything mentioned from verses 7 to 9 are actions that God is doing at the present. But of course, this is not the ultimate display of His justice. His ultimate display of justice will be seen on the last day, on the judgment day, when all who do wrong will be condemned, but all those who follow Christ and whose life has been changed will receive their reward. That's all going to happen in the future. But at present, what we have is a sample of the justice of God. The wicked occasionally will still get away with their evil deeds, but they will never get away from our righteous God. Because one day they will need to face God and they will receive the punishment due them for their unrighteous and wicked acts. And so what's the implication of that? That the Lord is our just God. It's a call for us to trust His work of justice. Sometimes we say it's very slow, right? In fact, we have the saying, justice delayed, justice denied. And it's true. It feels like, a court case would drag on for 20 years, 30 years with no resolution. But when we say that God is a God of justice, it's a call for us to trust in God's timing. That God will deliver His people. He will save us from oppression. He will save us from the wickedness of men. However, we need to believe that His plan is the best. He may choose to exercise it now, or maybe not in our lifetime, but maybe in the lifetime of our next generation. Or it could be in the eternal court too. But the most important thing is trust Him, because God has the best in mind when it comes to His righteousness, when it comes to His justice. And so as we look forward to the new year, 2018, I know that there will be many challenges, there will be many opportunities before us. But I hope that first and foremost, put your trust in God. Because God, through Psalm 146, has revealed to us He is powerful. Why? Because He created this world and He continues to sustain this world. Second, He helps us in our time of great need. He's our helper. And third, He is a righteous God. And all of these attributes of God are not just something that will happen in the future. All of them are seen in the present to varying degrees. And so I want to end with a question. The question is, of course, the title of our message. Will you trust Him? Will you trust God's guidance, God's protection, God's timing? Will you trust that His plans will come to pass just as He promised? Will you trust that He will keep His word no matter what? And so right now, to close, I just want us to take a few minutes to pray and to express our trust in God as we face 2018 and beyond. Tell Him that you will put your faith in Him, that you will walk with Him, that you will trust Him for whatever will happen. for whatever needs may arise, for whatever trials that may take place, for whatever opportunities that will come your way. Say to the Lord, Lord, I trust you. And then give thanks, worship Him. Okay, so let's do that right now for a minute or two, and then I will close this. Father, we thank you because we recognize you being the righteous God, our helper in time of need, as the all-powerful God who not only created us but sustains our life. And we know, Lord, that as we face this year, 2018, we can have confidence, knowing that you are in control, that you are the Lord and Master of our life, and that we need not worry, we need not fret. We pray, Lord, that all of us here, we will be constantly be driven to our knees to pray, to seek you, because we know, Lord, that we need to put our trust in you and not in people, not in human powers, not in the principalities. And Lord, we ask that Psalm 146, the promises that it holds, may be real in our lives to a certain extent, and may they find its ultimate fulfillment in your second coming, Lord Jesus, and when we enter into your kingdom. We thank you for the promise of your word, and may you continue to cause us to rejoice, cause us to worship you because of who you are and what you are doing. We pray this right now in Jesus' name.